I'm going to spend the next 5 minutes to illustrate to you how it is mathematically possible for the greatest crash in human history to occur this year. Let me begin. On October 4th, we warned the world that the U.S. stock markets topped and a great crash is about to begin in this video. And in addition, we uploaded numerous other videos, many of which went viral, warning the world of what is about to come. Within those videos, we presented what is called a rising wedge, and what happens when the wedge breaks, how a violent market sell-off can occur, and specifically how this rising wedge correlates directly to the crash of 1987, where the markets crashed 37%. Additionally, how this rising wedge directly correlates also to the great crash of 1929, where the markets crashed 49%. Now let's look at these charts, the crash of 1929 and the crash of 1987 in closer detail. In the crash of 87, we added this blue line. Now, from the initial crash point down, the markets in 1987 crashed a total of 10% on the initial crash. Following the initial crash, the markets retraced 70% back up, and that was then followed by a massive market plunge of 37%. Next, let's look at the crash of 1929. Again, we draw in this blue line, and from the top, the initial crash was 17% compared to the 10% crash of 1987. So this was a deeper crash that occurred. Following the crash, the markets then retraced back up 60%, and following the retrace, then the markets reversed and plunged 50% off the top. Next, let's see how this all correlates. Here's a chart that we have labeled the Great Crash of 2018-19. What you'll notice, this point here was the exact top we forecast within the video. From this initial crash point, we were looking for a crash into the month of December, which exactly occurred. That crash ended up being a 19% crash. This crash will end up being the first leg down. Since the crash, the markets have reversed back up. Sound familiar? That is exactly what happened in 1929 and in 1987. Once this reversal ends, which the U.S. markets now are getting into extreme heavy resistance here at 24,000 on the Dow, we should very shortly expect a price reversal and then a market plunge, just as we witnessed in the year 1987 and again in 1929. However, this plunge is going to be much, much worse. Let me explain. We live in biblical times, and in December of 2018, the initial crash was the opening of the third seal within Revelation. This initial crash took the market down 19%. Using this 19% initial crash number, we can potentially calculate the magnitude of the great crash that's about to happen. Let's look in detail at the math. Once again, the initial crash in 1987 was 10%. The initial crash in 1929 was 17%. And the initial crash into December was 19%. You'll notice the numbers are getting bigger. Now, off the initial 10% crash in 87, the markets then retraced 70% to ultimately crash 35%. Now, if we compare that to the crash of 1929, you'll notice the initial crash was 17%, followed by a lesser retrace of only 60%, and then ultimately ended up being a bigger crash. Notice, the bigger the percentage drop, the less the retracement, the bigger the drop. Now, let's compare that to current. You'll notice last year the crash was 19%, and as of the 9th of October, the markets have retraced 44%, currently trading at approximately 24,000 on the Dow. Now, should the markets retrace 50%, that would take the markets approximately 400 points higher. With a 19% crash on the initial leg down, potentially a 44% retracement to 24,000 on the Dow is sufficient. However, should the markets retrace higher, 24,400 would be 50% retracement. The point being is we should not expect a 60% retracement because the initial crash leg was greater than the prior two crashes. At maximum, we would probably expect a 50% retracement. However, 44% is currently sufficient as well. Therefore, any retracement between current levels and up to 50% is considered expected. Now, from this retracement level between 44 to say 50%, this is where it starts to get scary. If we look at the crash of 87, a 10% initial drop took it down 35%. A 17% crash in 1929 took it down 50%. Therefore, this present crash that began on October 4th, the initial leg down was 19%, so we minimum should see a greater than 50% crash on the plunge. If the crash is 50%, that would take the Dow down to 13,500 for a low. On the other hand, if it's supposed to be greater than 50%, we should at minimum expect 12,000 on the Dow on this crash. Should the crash go 60%, it would be 11,000, and 65% would be 10,000. Therefore, because of the 19% initial crash, this crash on the plunge should at minimum take the Dow down to 12,000, a 55% crash, because it needs to be mathematically greater than 50%. In other words, greater than the crash of 1929. And a 55% crash would end up being the greatest market crash in human history. Again, we are in the midst of the collapse right now. Please, we've warned numerous times, be sure to have silver and or gold, food and water for at least 2 months, and most importantly, this is a biblical crash. These are biblical times. Faith in the Father and His Son, Jesus.
Okay, so what you're saying is that the markets are about to crash.
Right.
Everybody's going to lose faith in the stock market, and the money is going to flow up and go to
Bitcoin, the alternate coins, gold and silver. We're going to have a massive financial shift.
A surprise gold rush, the likes of which the world has never seen, is at the doorstep in the greatest wealth transfer in human history. Please, a wise man foresees the difficulties ahead and prepares. The fool goes blindly on and suffers the consequences. Be wise. May God bless you and your entire family.